There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being unknown, but from being known partially, from giving people real access, real warmth, real presence, real care, and still leaving the conversation feeling like the most important part stayed somewhere else. Not deliberately, not defensively, just not, yet ready to be said out loud. Most people interpret this as distance, as guardedness, as something to be coaxed through or waited out. What it almost never gets interpreted as is what it usually is: a person with a rich, fully inhabited interior who simply doesn't feel the need to make it legible to everyone who asks. There's a particular kind of person who can sit across from someone they genuinely care about, answer their questions honestly, and still leave the conversation feeling like they barely scratched the surface of what was actually going on inside them, not because they were being dishonest, but because the real answer, the one they've been turning over for weeks, didn't quite feel ready to be said out loud yet. And psychology has a lot to say about why some people are built this way, because people who keep their inner world private aren't doing it out of coldness or distrust or a lack of things to say. They're often doing it because something in them treats the interior life as something precious, something that belongs to them in a way that most things don't. For some people, this will sound immediately familiar. Others will find themselves thinking of someone they've known for years, someone warm and present and genuinely engaged with the world, who they still sometimes feel they're only seeing from the outside. Both of those experiences are real, and both of them are worth understanding. There's a particular dynamic that people in this category know well, even if they've never named it. You're with someone, a friend, a family member, maybe a colleague you've grown genuinely close to over time, and they share something personal, something they've been carrying. And in the moment, you're fully present. You listen carefully. You respond with real care. But when the conversation reaches the natural moment where the focus might turn to you, where they ask what's going on with you, how you've really been, something happens. You give them something. You do. But it's a curated something, a real piece, but not the full picture. Not the thing you were actually sitting with at 2 in the morning last week. Not the thought you've been turning over for months that you haven't quite finished working out yet. You give them enough to be honest, and you keep the rest somewhere else. Sometimes it's not even a conscious decision. You open your mouth to answer, and somewhere in the gap between what you're actually carrying and what you're about to say, you realize that the real answer would take too long to explain, that it would require too much context, that giving it properly would turn a passing question into a whole conversation. And that feels like more than the moment is asking for. So you offer the shorter version instead and move on. And here's what makes this interesting. Most people in this category aren't entirely sure why they do it. It doesn't feel like hiding exactly. It feels more like not yet. Like the interior thing isn't ready to be said out loud. Like speaking it too early would change it in some way before you've fully understood what it is. Psychologists who study how people process emotions have noticed something interesting about individuals who tend to keep their inner lives private. It's not that they feel less. In many cases, they feel more, and more specifically. They have a relationship with their own interiority that's quite developed. They think about things thoroughly, often on their own, before they ever consider sharing them. And that internal processing isn't a prelude to sharing. For many of them, it's sufficient on its own. The thinking itself is the thing. The sharing, when it happens, is secondary. This is meaningfully different from avoidance. Avoidance is when someone pushes away from an internal experience because it's uncomfortable. What's happening here is closer to the opposite, a deep engagement with the interior that simply doesn't require an audience. The inner world isn't hidden from others because it's shameful or undeveloped. It's private because it's inhabited. There's a real distinction there, and it matters. The pattern shows up in some very specific, ordinary moments. It's possible you've had the experience of going through something significant, a difficult period, a meaningful realization, a grief you were navigating, and choosing, quite deliberately, not to mention it to almost anyone. Not because you were struggling to cope, but because you were handling it, and you didn't need the handling to be witnessed to make it real. Or maybe you've been in a group setting where people were going around sharing opinions and you had a fully formed view, something you'd thought through carefully, something you genuinely believed, and you kept it mostly to yourself, not from shyness, not because you doubted the view, but because something in you didn't feel the urgency to put it into the room. You were fine with it staying where it was, or there's the experience of being described by someone who knows you well. You're actually a very private person, and feeling something slightly complicated about that. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. Because from the inside, it doesn't feel like privacy as a wall. It feels more like having a room that's yours, that you live in fully, and that you're simply selective about who you invite in. The developmental roots of this pattern are worth sitting with because they're often more nuanced than the obvious explanations. Sometimes this kind of interior privacy develops in environments where sharing feelings was implicitly discouraged, where emotional expression was treated as something uncomfortable for others or as a sign of weakness, or where the inner life was simply never made a subject of conversation. Children raised in those environments learn early and efficiently to do their emotional processing internally. And that internal capacity, built out of necessity, becomes a fully developed inner world that feels more natural to inhabit than to display. But that's not the only origin. Some people develop a rich, private interior, not because sharing was discouraged, but because the inner life itself became a source of genuine pleasure very early. Reading alone. Thinking through problems, sitting with an experience until it became clear. For these people, privacy around the inner world isn't a response to an environment that couldn't hold them. It's a preference that developed naturally and deepened over time. What both origins share is the same outcome: a person who has a highly developed relationship with their own interior and who has never quite felt the need to make it legible to others in order for it to feel real. There's a deeper layer here that's worth naming because it comes up often for people who recognize themselves in this. One of the things that keeps the inner world private for certain people isn't just preference. It's a very specific kind of care around being misunderstood. Not a fear of it exactly, more like a disinclination toward it. When you have a thought or a feeling that you've been developing for a while, something subtle, something layered, something that required time to arrive at, the prospect of putting it into a conversation where it might be reduced or misread or responded to in a way that doesn't match what it actually is, that can feel worse than not sharing it at all. It's not that the response would be unkind, it's that the thing you'd be sharing is delicate in a specific way. It has a shape that matters. And conversation is an environment where shapes get rounded off quickly, where things get simplified in the back and forth, where nuance has a short half-life. So you hold onto it, not forever, but until you found the person or the moment where you feel fairly confident it would land intact. Some people recognize this as the reason they tend to write more honestly than they speak. The page doesn't interrupt. It doesn't simplify. It holds the shape of the thing without editing it down to fit a conversational exchange. It's worth being honest about the costs of this way of being because they're real. The most common one is a particular kind of loneliness that's hard to explain. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't quite have the full picture of you, who know you genuinely and care for you genuinely, but who are working from an edited version. A version where the most interesting and most complicated parts got left on the inside. Sometimes the editing is so habitual that people in this category lose track of how much they're doing it. They're warm, they're engaged, they're genuinely present in their relationships, and they've also been quietly withholding access to themselves for so long that even when someone creates real space, when someone actually asks slowly and with patience, the retrieval takes effort, not because there's nothing there, because there's so much and it's so rarely been requested that reaching it can feel like descending into a room that doesn't often get visitors. And yet, and this is where the reframe becomes important, the inner life that people in this category protect so carefully is almost always extraordinary, because the thoughts that never quite make it into conversation don't disappear. They develop, they compound, they go somewhere that externalized thinking rarely reaches. The person who processes internally, who turns things over in private, who sits with an experience until it's fully understood, That person tends to arrive at conclusions that are more considered, more layered, more genuinely their own than conclusions reached in the hot friction of social exchange. There's a kind of knowing that only grows in quiet, a kind of self-understanding that only develops when you've spent enough time in your own company to actually hear yourself. And people who keep their inner world private often have more of this than almost anyone they know, including the people who appear to have everything figured out because they talk about themselves all the time. So the next time you find yourself giving someone a real but partial answer, holding the deeper thing for later, or for yourself, or for no one, it might not mean you're closed off or emotionally unavailable. It might simply mean your inner life is something you take seriously, that you treat your own interiority with the same care you'd extend to anything you find genuinely valuable. That you understand somewhere underneath all the habit that not everything that matters needs to be said aloud to be real. The room you keep for yourself isn't emptiness. It's the most inhabited place you have. And the people who eventually earn a glimpse of it, the ones you decide are worth the careful act of being known, those people tend to understand immediately what they've been given. So now I'm curious. Are you someone who keeps most of your inner world to yourself, who tends to process privately and share selectively? Or are you more the opposite, someone who thinks out loud, who needs to say the thing to understand what it is? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever felt like the people around you only know part of you, that's worth saying too.